Welcome to your English Voice episode 10, a free experience inside the world of Inglés con Victoria to help you sound as confident, fluent, and professional in English as you do in Spanish. Every week, I'll bring you short, potent trainings that will help you amplify your global presence and own your English voice. My name is Maria Victoria Perez. I'm a neuro language coach, teacher of English and accent specialist, and also the founder of Inglés con Victoria. In today's episode, we are going to explore the reasons why studying more, practicing more might not work for the professional in global roles and what to do instead. I know a lot of you have been following generic advice, such as listening to podcasts, reading more, doing more grammar, speaking with friends every day, and yet you feel stuck at an intermediate level, which means you understand a lot, but you can't speak fluently, let alone confidently. So, today we're going to break this down into three main topics: why generic advice can keep you stuck at getting by, also known as defenderse, the difference between passive practice and intentional brain friendly practice, how to structure your practice so it truly builds high level communication skills for the global professional. So, by the end of this episode, you will understand why repetition doesn't always work and why this generic advice keeps you stuck at a me defiendo level, and what you can do instead to maximize your time that you invest studying and therefore your results. So let's get started with our first topic, which is generic advice. A lot of professionals try to learn English on their own, following advice from people who might not really know how language is acquired. For example, tips that I see all the time are listen to podcasts to learn English, read more books in English, watch movies with English subtitles, listen to music. And even though this generic advice has or may have a place in the ecosystem of exercises that you do, if you only follow them without the guidance of a professional, you will remain stuck at a get by level. And that's a level that won't help you navigate professional scenarios successfully and with confidence. Because when we're talking about English for professionals in global roles, we are not just talking about a person going to show up in a meeting and only be a listener. We are talking about influencing others, collaborating successfully in global teams, building international relationships, and paving the way for your career growth. So, getting by is not enough. That's why you feel so much self doubt. You avoid meetings, and sometimes you have to reject offers because if you accept them, you are not confident in your English skills. What you want to do is to master high level communication skills in English so that people want to listen to you and take your ideas clearly. And that, believe me, you won't be able to develop those skills by listening to a podcast, even if that podcast is about high level communication skills in English. Mm-mm. To develop a skill, you need the practice and the guidance, and it has to be intentional practice. So, this leads me to my next topic, which is the difference between passive practice and intentional brain friendly practice. Let's take the example of a podcast. You heard this advice and you're following through, you're listening to podcasts. But that alone is very passive, and passive doesn't make connections. For me, listening to a podcast or anything and just in a passively form, like a form of entertainment, is the equivalent to wanting to run a marathon but training in a treadmill. You can use a treadmill to train you for a 5K, but not a marathon. For a high level performance, you need strategic training. And that's what is required for you in a global setting. You will be required to think at multiple levels. So just listening or reading alone won't cut it. Now, if you're just starting, like if your level of English is lower than an intermediate or you're at an intermediate level, you might leverage this generic advice and use it in your favor to amplify the awareness of what the English language is, and also leverage implicit learning. So yes, there is a benefit to immersing yourself in the language. That is for sure. But you can optimize that benefit by receiving a strategic, intentional, brain friendly practice. So, going back to what I was saying, if you are just starting out, yes, immerse yourself in the language as much as you can, because you definitely need that knowledge. But once you acquire certain level of knowledge, now you want to narrow and be so much more intentional in how you use your mental energy, capacity, and bandwidth to memorize, learn, and really anchor what you're learning. So, let me give you an example of what intentional active learning can look like. And I'm going to follow the advice of a podcast. If you're listening to a podcast, do you have some questions to answer to? Why are you even listening? What is the information that you want to really find out? So ask yourself the question so that when you listen with a purpose, with a very specific purpose. Second, what type of vocabulary are you going to learn and why? Why is the set of words that you chose useful or important, worth your time? How are you planning to use what you learn in real conversations? You see, now the scenario changes completely. This is a different story. Now we are being a lot more intentional and we are more actively engaging with that episode, with that podcast. This is something that is amazing, but we know that it can be generic advice because even though, of course, practicing listening to people will help you improve your listening comprehension skills, but there is another skill that will have a dramatic impact on how much you can understand, the depth of your understanding, and that it will also improve the clarity of your speech and how fluent you are. And that is learning about the general American accent. For example, you can pick the accent that you want, but I teach the general American accent. So when you learn this accent, something magical happens in your ears. You start to understand a lot of subtle, nuanced aspects of the English language, and you can understand different accents. You can understand cultural meanings and subtle differences in speech. So, mastering a second language to use it professionally requires a lot more than just generic advice. So if you are someone who really likes studying on his own, That's great, but I would highly recommend that if you want to have great results and make it in a shorter amount of time, hire a professional. So now that we talked about the difference between passive learning and active learning, let me give you some ideas on how to practice smarter. This is our third topic, and I've already started this conversation in the second topic, but now let's do it more brain friendly. By now we know that generic advice like listen to podcasts, study more, do more grammar, speak more, don't really create outstanding results. The key is to practice smarter and, of course, in an active, intentional way. So, for example, if you memorize words in a list out of context, that is very poor learning technique. That you are just relying on rote memorization, which is kind of like the equivalent to using just the left part of the brain. What you want to do is to really make sure you are creating a really wide number of connections, because the more connections that you can make, the easier will be for you to retrieve that vocabulary. Another smart way to practice your speaking is by understanding how the brain works. So, one thing is to practice speaking with your friend when your brain is calm, when there's nothing at stakes. A very different thing is to speak English in a meeting, in a professional setting, or with your boss. That changes the rules of the game and therefore how you feel. So, one of the techniques that you can use here is to learn about the brain. Learn how to regulate your brain so that you can be as calm as possible, so that your communication flows. You are not really anxious, you're more focused on the meaning and not so much what's going on inside you, in those stories that you are telling yourself, in those emotions that are really giving you some anxiety and that is blocking your access to your knowledge. And just like running a marathon, mastering English requires a plan. If you're planning to run a marathon, you are going to hire a specialist because they will teach you how to build your stamina, your resistance, and techniques so that you don't get hurt in the process. The same is with English. And I highly recommend you join one of my mentorships where we go deep into these topics while you improve your English and your communication skills in English. And this is something that I see a lot of people forget or not notice. High level communication skills for Latinos is a high paid skill. Yet, some people want to DIY it, improvise it, waste time, money, energy. For some people, really mastering the language is the only possibility for them to double, triple, quadruple their income. So, knowing this, invest wisely. Invest in a training that will help you collapse time, that will help you gain those results a lot faster. And that's why I invite you to my world, to my mentorships, because those are the containers where we go deep into all these topics while you master your communication skills in English. So, to wrap up, Generic advice will just get you by, but it will not make you a high level communicator in English. Rote memorization and more practice alone are not enough. Your brain needs active, intentional, and brain friendly training. If you want to master English to use it in professional settings, you need to practice smarter. If you want to study in a smarter, more strategic way, I highly recommend you to check out my mentorship, such as the English Mastery System, Smart English, or Clear English Confident Voice. I will leave all the information down below, so go there and check it out. So don't forget to make your practice a lot more intentional and brain friendly, and see how you advance not just in your English mastery, but also in your career. All right, my loved ones, see you in the next ones. And remember, we only have 2 more episodes left before we finish our first season of the Confidence Arena inside the world of Inglés con Victoria. It has been a pleasure to walk you through these different episodes, different trainings, and help you see a different, more successful and intentional way of mastering and owning your English voice. See you in our next episode.